Alex and Jordan stood on the sidewalk outside their childhood home, with nothing but a single suitcase between them. This wasn't a choice they made, it was an ultimatum. Their parents had plenty of money, certainly enough to be stable and provide the safety net they had promised for years. But promises have a way of breaking much faster than you'd ever expect when control is on the line. The trouble started when Alex decided to head off to art school, which their parents immediately called a reckless waste of time. They demanded Alex get a real job and build a concrete future, but Jordan stepped in to defend the dream. Jordan saw the truth, realizing their parents were just afraid and using their bank account to keep their own children small. The argument turned into a screaming match until the kind of line was crossed that you can never really take back. Their father looked them in the eye and said if they walked out that door, they should never bother coming back. Alex walked out that night, and Jordan followed just 1 week later. 6 months of total silence followed, where no one called and no texts were sent to bridge the gap. Then, out of nowhere, a lawyer reached out with an inventory of their inheritance that totaled exactly $5,000. That was the price their parents put on their relationship, and it had to be split right down the middle. $2,500 doesn't go far in a city where rent alone takes $1,500 every single month. The math was simple and terrifying, meaning they had maybe 8 weeks before they'd be forced to live out of Jordan's old Honda. That was when Jordan stumbled across a strange government auction listing for surplus military property from the Cold War era. It was an old radar dome sitting on 5 acres of dead, dusty land miles away from the city lights. The starting bid was only $10.
Nobody else wanted the place because it was rusted through, had no water, and didn't even have a real floor. But to them, it wasn't just a hunk of metal. It was land, and it was a roof they could call their own. They put in their bid, and they actually won the auction for $10. For about the same price as 2 cups of coffee, these 2 siblings suddenly owned a massive piece of American history. The hardest part of this story is that their parents weren't actually cruel people in the way you might imagine. They were just people who obsessed over control and confused love with power, unable to stand back and let their kids make their own way. Growing up, Alex and Jordan heard the same speech about the family legacy every single time they sat down for dinner. Their dad worked hard in construction, while their mum was a dedicated nurse, and they always promised the house would belong to the kids one day.
They had great credit and a perfect plan. But plans usually fall apart the moment fear enters the room. The cracks started showing during Alex's sophomore year, when the idea of art school first came up as a possibility. Their parents shut the conversation down instantly, claiming it wasn't practical and that Alex would just end up broke and hungry. They probably thought they were being protective, but to a teenager with a dream, it felt like a cage. By the time junior year rolled around, Alex had built a massive portfolio and earned several spots in prestigious programs with scholarships attached. None of that mattered to their parents, who had already decided that art was a little hobby and definitely not a career. Jordan watched this entire drama unfold and felt something inside the family dynamic start to snap. It was painful to watch a sibling get quieter and smaller every day, just to avoid another fight at the dinner table.
So when Alex finally found the courage to say they were leaving anyway, Jordan didn't even have to think twice about it. Jordan promised to go too, because family is supposed to stick together when things get hard. Their parents didn't understand the gravity of the situation and figured this was just a phase of teenage rebellion. They honestly thought that if they held a firm line and cut off the money, their kids would eventually fold and come crawling home. "If you leave," their dad warned them, "don't come back, because we won't spend a dime supporting choices like that." Those words sat in the bottom of Alex's chest like a heavy stone that wouldn't go away. Alex packed a single bag that night with just the bare essentials, while Jordan waited a week hoping the tempers would cool down. They waited for a phone call or a sorry that never came, and eventually, Jordan realized the silence was the only answer they were going to get.
The months that followed were long and hungry in a way that goes much deeper than just needing a meal. They slept on couches and worked dead-end jobs for minimum wage while scraping by on whatever they could find. They never reached out for help because their pride was too strong, and they knew deep down their parents meant every word of that threat. Then the final blow arrived in the form of a cold letter from a local law office. Their parents had officially changed their will and decided to sell the family home to give the money to a charity. Alex and Jordan were left with a $5,000 inheritance, which was a clear message that they had chosen their path and were now on their own. After splitting it, they had $2,500 each to survive on. The reality of their situation was brutal when you considered that rent, lights, and food would eat that up in 2 months.
Jordan was sitting at a library computer one afternoon, just scrolling through job boards, when that auction listing popped up. It was a government surplus sale for a Cold War radar dome built back in 1962. The price was listed at $10. The idea was completely absurd and born out of total desperation, but it was the only thing they could actually afford. "We could live there," Jordan said, pointing at the screen while Alex looked over at the peeling white paint and rusted bolts. There were no utilities and no modern comforts, but it was a place where no one could tell them to leave. They placed the bid, and they won the property. For the cost of almost nothing, they had finally bought themselves a future. The drive out to the property took a full 2 hours, with Jordan behind the wheel. Alex sat in the passenger seat, mostly silent, scrolling through the listing photos on a phone screen that didn't do the scale of the place justice. As they drove, the highway began to narrow, and the trees pressed in from both sides until the last signs of civilization simply fell away. Then, without warning, the land opened up. The dome rose out of the flat horizon like a fallen moon or something from another world. It was 60 feet across, maybe even higher, a perfect geodesic sphere made of metal panels that had been fighting the elements for decades. Long strips of white paint hung off the sides like peeling skin. While some panels were rusted through to a dark, angry orange, others looked almost brand new, as if time had somehow forgotten to touch them. A single heavy metal door sat on the side with a padlock hanging wide open. They parked the car and just stood there in the silence. The wind moved through the tall grass with a dry hiss, and the dome caught the afternoon light, throwing it back at them with a blinding glare. "We actually own this," Alex said, the words sounding thin in the open air. "We own this," Jordan repeated, though it didn't feel real yet. They stepped forward and pushed the door open, forcing it to creak on hinges that hadn't moved in a generation. Inside, the light bled through gaps in the metal skin, casting a strange grid of shadows across the floor. The interior was one massive, hollow space where the cold air smelled of old rust, heavy dust, and the weight of passing years. In the center of the room, metal stairs spiraled up to a platform 30 feet above their heads. Old equipment sat abandoned in the corners, featuring control panels with switches and dials that meant absolutely nothing to them now. Thick cables were coiled like sleeping snakes across the cracked concrete floor. "This was a radar station," Jordan noted, leaning in to read a faded plaque near the entrance. "Cold War era, built in 1962. They started to climb the stairs, moving carefully as the metal groaned and protested under their weight. Every step felt like a question, making them wonder how long it had been since a human voice echoed in here, or how long it had been since this place actually mattered to anyone. The platform at the top was narrow and faced a wall of what used to be windows. Most of the glass was shattered, leaving nothing but empty frames that looked out over the entire 5-acre spread of overgrown grass and skeletal trees. In the distance, the highway looked like a thin ribbon connecting them to a world that felt 1,000 miles away. Up here, the isolation was total. They were completely alone. "We could fix this up and make it livable," Alex said, staring out at the view. "We could build real walls inside and turn it into a home." Jordan looked around the cavernous shell, clearly not convinced. "It's a metal dome, Alex. I don't even know how you'd heat a space like this or get utilities inside when it's basically just a giant tin can." But they were committed now because they had no other choice. They owned it, and the only alternative was sleeping in the back of the Honda. They spent that first night in the car, parked right near the entrance. When the second morning arrived, they went back inside to start exploring the corners they had missed. They found a desk and some filing cabinets tucked away, along with a chair that had stuffing spilling out of the cushions like guts.
Papers were scattered everywhere, mostly old maintenance logs and weather reports that didn't explain why a place like this existed in the middle of nowhere. They found a supply closet filled with mops and buckets, all of it buried under a layer of dust thick enough to write their names in. By the afternoon, Jordan was walking the perimeter of the main floor when something caught his eye. Near the back of the dome, the floor wasn't quite level, and he noticed a thin seam running across the concrete. It was barely visible, just a faint line you'd miss unless you were looking for a reason to find it. He knelt down and traced the line with his fingers, kicking up clouds of gray dust that had been settling there for years. "Alex!" he called out, his voice echoing. "There's something back here!" Alex walked over and saw the seam. The two of them stood there staring at that thin line, realizing without a word that they had just stumbled onto something that was never meant to be found. The seam was about 2 inches wide and formed a rough rectangle, roughly 8 feet by 6 feet.
It cut right through the back section of the floor as if someone had carved a door into the earth and then tried to seal it shut forever.
Jordan ran his hand along the edge again, and more dust rose up in small, choking clouds. This wasn't just a few years of neglect. This was decades of accumulation. "There is definitely something under our feet," Jordan said. Alex looked skeptical and shook her head. "It's probably just a settling crack in the concrete, which happens all the time in buildings this old." Jordan wasn't listening to the excuses because he was already searching for a way to get underneath the edge. He needed a way to lift it, a way to see what was being hidden. They found a small indent on the south side of the rectangle that was barely a depression in the metal rim. It was just enough space for a finger or the tip of a crowbar to get some leverage. They grabbed a heavy, rust-orange crowbar from the pile of old tools leaning against the wall. The first attempt did nothing but scrape the metal, but the second try made the floor groan with a sound like a giant waking up from a long sleep. On the third try, the concrete panel finally shifted. It only moved an inch, but that was enough to see the metal tracks hidden underneath. This wasn't a crack or a flaw in the construction. It was a hatch built into the floor and hidden in plain sight. They pried again with everything they had until the hatch finally lifted on groaning hinges. Below the opening was nothing but darkness, a deep, perfect blackness that seemed to swallow the light from the room above. Alex stood up and wiped her hands. "We need the flashlights." They ran back to the car and grabbed 2 cheap plastic lights from the glove compartment. When Alex clicked hers on, the beam was weak and yellow, but it was enough to show them the way down. Alex went first, her boots echoing on the metal rungs.
The stairs were bolted directly into the concrete and descended about 15 feet into the earth. As they climbed down, the air turned cool and damp, feeling like a basement that had been sealed shut for a lifetime. It felt like they were stepping into a time capsule that the rest of the world had forgotten. At the bottom, they found a room that was completely hidden beneath the dome. The space was packed with equipment. There were racks of high-end, military-grade servers that must have cost a fortune when they were new. Control panels with dark screens and keyboards were connected by a web of cables that looked incredibly organized and intentional. Jordan found a generator in the corner and lifted the tarp, releasing the sharp, heavy smell of old oil. There were dozens of gray metal filing cabinets standing against the walls, all of them closed and waiting. On the far wall hung a large paper map marked with aggressive red lines and specific coordinates.
There were handwritten notes in the margins, and the script looked urgent, like someone had been scribbling in a desperate hurry.
"This wasn't just a radar station," Alex whispered, her voice sounding tiny in the cramped underground room. "It's a surveillance center," Jordan said, and he knew he was right. They stood there in the dark while their flashlight beams cut through dust particles that hung in the air like ghosts. The gear was old, maybe from the 70s or 80s, which meant it was much newer than the dome itself. Someone had built this secret room long after the station was supposed to be decommissioned and abandoned. Jordan reached out and opened one of the filing cabinets, and the drawer slid open with a soft, metallic whisper. Inside were hundreds of folders, each one labeled with a string of numbers rather than a name or a location. Alex pulled a folder at random and found satellite images and more of that cramped, shaky handwriting in the margins.
It looked like the work of someone who was under an incredible amount of pressure.
"This is classified," Jordan said, pointing to a bold stamp on the cover of the folder. "It was classified," Alex corrected him, "but that was decades ago." They looked at the map again, trying to make sense of the red lines connecting different points on the grid. Arrows pointed towards specific coordinates, as if someone had been tracking a target across the country. They didn't touch anything else that night. They just stood in that hidden room, finally understanding that their desperate purchase of a worthless property had landed them in the middle of something dangerous. They had found a secret, and secrets are usually buried for a reason. They climbed back up into the dome and stood in the light, neither of them saying a word for a long time. Once the hatch was sealed and the concrete panel settled back into place, the floor looked completely normal again.
It was unbroken and solid, as if nothing had ever been there at all. But they knew better. Inside the car, Jordan finally broke the silence. "We need to figure out exactly what we're looking at. We need to know if we're in danger," Alex corrected him. That night, they drove to a public library in the next town over and found a corner with an old desktop computer. There were no security cameras pointed their way and no record of who they were, which gave them the anonymity they needed. Jordan started typing, his fingers moving across keywords that felt wrong to even search. He looked into Cold War surveillance programs, declassified military documents, and secret history. The location of the dome actually matched something in the official records. It was listed as a listening post, a station built to monitor communications across a specific region, and the files said it was decommissioned in 1962. That was the official story anyway.
But the equipment they had just seen was far too advanced for the early 60s. It looked like technology from the 70s or maybe even the 80s, which meant someone had installed it in secret long after the station was supposed to be empty. Alex found a PDF of a government report that was heavily redacted, with entire pages blacked out. At the very top, the title was still visible: SIGINT Operations, Eastern Theater, 1975 to 1985. SIGINT stood for Signals Intelligence. It was clear now that someone had been running an unauthorized surveillance operation out of that dome. Since it was unauthorized, it was off the books and hidden from any kind of oversight, meaning someone desperately wanted to keep its existence a secret. As they dug deeper, they found references to programs that had been partially declassified, and they began to piece together a frightening picture. A group of military intelligence officers had believed the official channels were compromised, so they decided to set up their own private network and surveillance operation. The radar dome was just one of several hidden stations that ran in parallel to the official system. This shadow operation lasted for about 10 years before it stopped abruptly, without any explanation or farewell. The last date they could find on any of the documents was 1984, which was exactly 40 years ago. "Someone walked away from this," Alex said while scrolling through another page of blacked-out text. "And for some reason they left everything behind." "Or maybe they left it on purpose," Jordan suggested. "It could be insurance or some kind of proof." They looked at each other across the desk, and a quiet understanding passed between them that didn't need words. The folders in that room, the old photographs, and the map were all pieces of evidence. They still didn't know exactly what the evidence proved, but it was clear that someone had gone to great lengths to keep it buried. They left the library just before it closed and drove back to the dome in total silence. This time, they didn't hesitate to go back down into the dark. They opened the filing cabinets with more care and used their phones to photograph the documents, not because they wanted to sell them, but because they had to understand the truth. One folder stood out because it was labeled differently than the rest. While most of the files just had codes, this one had a name written in the corner in careful handwritten script: Colonel Marcus Webb. The date on the folder was 1984, and inside was a long, dense letter addressed to someone whose name had been torn away. The handwriting was frantic, as if it had been written with a great sense of urgency. It wasn't just a report, it was a confession. They spent the next several days living in that underground room, taking shifts to photograph documents and read through decades of intelligence reports. They brought food and stayed down there for hours at a time until their eyes burned and their heads felt heavy with the weight of other people's secrets. Slowly, the real story began to emerge from the dust. The radar dome was originally built in 1962 to monitor Soviet communications,
and that part of the story was well documented and real. But by the time the 70s rolled around, the mission changed into something else entirely. The Cold War was supposed to be thawing during a period of détente. The official narrative told the world that the threat was decreasing and that the two superpowers were finally moving toward understanding instead of total annihilation. But Colonel Marcus Webb believed that the exact opposite was happening. Webb was a high-ranking military intelligence officer with access to the highest levels of classified briefings. After years of watching the official channels and reading the standard reports, he became convinced that the information being shared was incomplete and dangerous. He believed there was a deeper threat that the official government was either missing or choosing to ignore. Because of this, he did something illegal and extraordinary by assembling a secret team of people he trusted. They were the ones who installed the hidden equipment, built the underground room, and set up a surveillance network that didn't officially exist. The photographs they found showed satellite imagery and coordinates, with red lines on the wall connecting different points to show they were tracking something. But the targets weren't Soviet. Alex and Jordan realized the truth while reading through a handwritten journal Webb had kept. The entries were methodical and careful, but they revealed a terrifying reality. The targets were American. Webb was tracking American military movements and conversations at the highest levels of command without any authorization or oversight. He was breaking the law and spying on his own people, but he believed it was the only way to save the country. The letter explained his reasoning. He had been reading between the lines of official reports and seeing patterns that simply didn't add up. He heard rumors from his contacts within the military establishment that pointed toward a massive conspiracy involving people at the very top of the chain of command. He suspected they were planning a coup or a false flag operation to trigger a war, something that would allow a small group of people to grab even more power. Webb was trying to gather enough undeniable evidence to take to someone who would actually listen and take action. But in 1984, the trail went cold. The letter didn't say exactly what happened, only that they found out, and he was forced to go dark. He wrote that this room was the only record of what he had discovered. Alex and Jordan pulled the official blueprints of the dome from a filing cabinet labeled Original Specifications. They were dry, technical documents filled with floor plans and engineering diagrams. According to those blueprints, the hidden room didn't exist. There was no underground level, no basement, and no evidence of anything beneath the concrete floor. The official plans showed a simple platform and stairs, but they were standing in a room that proved the documents were a lie. The blueprints were faked, Jordan said as the scale of the cover-up started to sink in. Someone built this room in secret, Alex added, and then they erased every record of it ever being here. But Webb left the evidence anyway, Jordan said, looking back at the letter and the coordinates written in the margin of the final page.
At the very end, Webb had written a single line. "The truth is buried here. It will be found when the time is right."
Alex and Jordan made a final decision that night. They weren't going to go public yet, not until they understood the full story and could prove everything. They would keep researching and verifying every detail until they found the truth that had been buried for 40 years. Knowing the truth changed everything for them, but it wasn't the kind of change you feel when you suddenly come into money or win a big prize. This was something much heavier that settled deep into their bones and made it impossible to ever look at the world the same way again. Once they had seen those documents and read those words, there was no going back to being the people they were before they stepped into that hidden room. They still had to survive, of course, so they focused on making the dome a place where human beings could actually live. They took on every side job and gig they could find to scrape together enough cash to run electricity from the highway and hit water with a well on the property. To keep from freezing during the long nights, they built actual walls inside the massive shell to create rooms that felt like a real home. Even as they turned the concrete shell into a sanctuary, they kept the hidden room downstairs completely sealed and untouched. It sat there beneath the floor like a secret they were holding in trust for a man who was no longer around to protect it. Their nights were spent hunched over glowing screens or sitting in quiet library corners, digging through every digitized government record they could get their hands on. They followed threads that seemed to lead nowhere until a single name or date would suddenly blow the whole thing wide open.
When they reached out to historians or journalists, they were careful not to show their full hand, asking just enough questions to piece together a picture from the fragments Webb had left behind. The more they dug, the more they learned about the man who started it all, Colonel Marcus Webb. He passed away in 1987, which was only 3 years after he penned that final letter and disappeared from the public eye. The official records said it was a heart attack, a clean and simple explanation that most people would never think to question. But the timing felt wrong to Alex and Jordan, because he died right as his evidence was hidden and his entire operation was being scrubbed from existence. They started finding traces of the other men on Webb's team, but the stories all ended the same way. Some had walked away from the military the second the operation ended, while others died in the years that followed under circumstances that were never fully explained.
A few of them simply vanished from the face of the earth, leaving no public record or paper trail behind, as if they had never existed at all. It was as if a giant eraser had moved across history to wipe out the operation and everyone who had been a part of it. But the evidence was still there, tucked away in a dome in the middle of nowhere, waiting for someone to care enough to keep it safe. Alex and Jordan stayed awake through many long nights when they realized that by owning this property, they had inherited Webb's heavy burden. The letter had been left for whoever was lucky or unlucky enough to find it, telling them they would have to decide what to do with the truth. That responsibility now fell on 2 kids who had started with nothing, but were now the guardians of a secret that very powerful people had spent decades trying to bury.
They thought about going to the authorities, but they had to wonder which ones they could actually trust when the system itself was what made Webb's team disappear. If they went to the media, there was a good chance nobody would even listen to 2 kids with no backing who claimed to find classified secrets in a $10 building. They could have just kept it a secret and lived their lives as if the concrete floor didn't have a ghost living under it. Instead, they made a choice to document every single thing they found with the kind of care that would hold up in court. They decided to protect the evidence and wait for the right moment when the truth could be told without putting innocent people in the line of fire. In the meantime, they had a roof over their heads and a purpose that had transformed them from cast-offs into protectors of something that actually mattered. 5 years later, the 2 of them were still living in the dome, but the world around them had started to shift.
The property actually had real value now, and they could have easily sold it to walk away with enough money to get a normal apartment or go back to school. Real estate agents started calling because the location was becoming popular and they could have cashed out and left the secrets behind forever. But they chose to stay and turn the dome into something nobody expected. It became a research center where historians could come to study the Cold War era, though none of the visitors knew what was actually resting beneath their feet. They began reaching out to universities and specialists who had spent their entire careers trying to understand that specific slice of history. By sharing just enough of the non-sensitive documents to spark interest, they made the dome a place people wanted to study without ever revealing the hidden room. The property that the family once thought was a worthless pile of junk had become a legitimate historical site with a meaning that money couldn't buy.
The hidden rooms stayed sealed, acting as their private sanctuary for the map and the classified folders Webb had died to protect. Even though the rooms stayed closed, the research Alex and Jordan shared helped fill in the blanks for historians who had been asking the same questions for 40 years. They managed to solve old mysteries and provide the context that finally made sense of the strange decisions made during the height of the Cold War. They did all of this while keeping their word to Webb, making sure his team stayed safe and no innocent lives were ruined by the revelation. Even the situation with their family started to change as the years went by and the dust settled. Their parents eventually reached out, and while it wasn't exactly a formal apology, it was an admission that they had been wrong. They admitted they were afraid and had let that fear turn into a need for control that they eventually mistook for love. Alex and Jordan listened to what they had to say, but they were careful about how much they let them back in. They built a new kind of relationship based on firm boundaries and honesty rather than the old games of manipulation. The inheritance they were denied by their own blood ended up coming to them in a way they never could have imagined. It wasn't a bank account or a suburban house, but a sense of purpose and a home that they had built with their own 2 hands. They learned the hard lesson that their parents never quite grasped, which is that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what you were actually meant to do. Being cast out was painful, but it was the only thing that led them to a place where they finally belonged. The dome is still standing out there today, and the paint is still peeling off the sides just like it was on the day they bought it. Down in the dark, the equipment in the hidden room sits waiting for a future that might never arrive. But the building isn't just a relic of military paranoia anymore. It stands as a monument to the power of the truth, and a reminder of what happens when you refuse to let the world bury its secrets. Subscribe to see justice served in the next story. That old radar dome taught them a lesson their own flesh and blood never could, showing them that being kicked out with nothing wasn't the end of their story. It was actually just the beginning, because what they found in that hidden room wasn't about the money or the property. They found proof that ordinary people can uncover extraordinary truths, and sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't what you are given, but what you discover when everything else is taken away. Subscribe to see justice served in the next story.